You're listening to Conflict Radio on the Conflict Radio Network. Greetings, and welcome to Conflict Radio. Today is January 14th, 2021, and we are well into the winter. We are coming to you from Huntsville, Alabama, and today we're going to have David Weatherly on the show. His newest book, Monsters at the Crossroads, is available now. He also has a ton of other books. I recommend checking out his website, eerielights.com. You can just Google David Weatherly, or the link will be in the description box below. Well, I don't want to waste too much time yapping up a storm, so let's just get right to it. We'll be right back on Conflict Radio with David Weatherly right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. I've got David Weatherly with us. His newest book, Monsters at the Crossroads, Cryptids and Legends of Indiana, is out. David, how are you today?
I'm great, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
Man, it's awesome to have you on. We're beaming to you from Huntsville, Alabama, and I got to ask you, first and foremost, how long before we get an Alabama book on cryptids?
Well, the Cryptid State series is really rolling out. I just announced the newest one, which is North Carolina. That'll be out in probably early February. And I don't have Alabama scheduled yet, but you know, it's funny because I get messages constantly. Everybody's asking, when are you going to do my state? When are you going to do this one and that one? And it's kind of very organic. I do have the next several planned out already. And in fact, I've already worked on the next several, but I can't promise a date on Alabama yet at this point.
All right. Well, I'm sure you've been getting some stories from the Alabama folk down here. I think we have something called the Alabama White Thang. Have you heard of that?
Oh, I have. Yeah, that's a pretty curious creature. It's interesting because it sort of is a great example of this blend, I believe, of actual accounts, a little bit of folklore, and maybe some mistaken identities and so forth. But one of the things curious about this creature, and I don't know how much you've looked into this beast yourself, but one of the curious things in this case is that the descriptions vary pretty widely. Now, the accounts go back for, about 100 years. I know that there are accounts from at least the early 1930s documenting this thing. And through the years, it has sort of morphed at times. And some of the accounts are reporting something that sounds like an albino sasquatch. They're talking about a tall creature that's 7 or 8 feet in height and covered with white hair. Some of the characteristics they talk about in the sightings involve, like these dreadful screams that people hear at night. Some people describe it as sounding like a woman, or some people say it sounds, sort of cat-like. And then other people talk about these different sounds that it makes. Some people describe it as sort of a deep barking. But, if we look at Sasquatch counters from around the country and even abroad, then we hear these different vocalizations reported, this sort of, this huffing sound that could be interpreted as a bark by some people. So we get that set of descriptions attached to this creature, but then we get other descriptions that really sound completely different. It sounds like they're talking about something that is more cat-like. They talk about it moving on all fours, that it's very quick, that it has a cat-like head in some accounts. And when I looked into this briefly, I saw that the early accounts seem to stick a little bit more to this theme, that it's something sort of cat-like. Now, they still say it has white hair, obviously from the popular name, but they're talking about something. In some cases, they say it resembles a lion. Other people talk about it lurking in trees and waiting to pounce on people. So we get these cat-like characteristics that are portrayed in some of the early accounts, but what we also get are things that sound very much more like folklore. There's an account from the early, I think it's from the 1930s also, that talks about a gentleman who saw it, and that, it's kind of it's almost a silly account. He talks about seeing this thing and that it fell asleep next to him, and he woke up with this thing just laying there, and it didn't harm him, but it just looked at him and kind of went away. And, you get these really odd pieces of lore that have crept in and all combined to make up the body of legend around this creature, this white thang, as they call it. And I think, especially if we look at modern accounts, I think what we're seeing in modern times is a sasquatch that people are seeing. It's either an albino or it just has very, very light hair. And it's one of those cases where people are having a strange experience and they're attaching it to the mythos that has grown up there over the years.
Would that be primarily the stories of this thing coming out of the Talladega Forest?
Yeah, mostly. I mean, there's a whole region in Alabama that covers 3 counties. So Jefferson, Morgan, and Etowah.
Okay.
And this region is where most of the reports of this thing have come from. You go back to the early accounts, and there's other bizarre things that are attached to it, because there's a report that it resembles a kangaroo with a cat's head. There are reports in the early days that it has some kind of connection to funerals. So it's commonly showing up in early accounts at funerals, at wakes, at graveyards. People are reporting sightings of it. But as I said, it's really strange. It seems to be one of these cases where we have a true blending of different facets of both folklore and maybe, certainly from the early period, some creative storytelling probably, but then actual encounters also with some kind of a strange creature, or very possibly more than one type of unusual creature that have, just all been thrown into the pot, so to speak, to create one central bit of lore around this particular creature.
Huh, that's fascinating. Do they have other, I guess, creatures that they talk about in Alabama, or is it just the white thing?
Well, that's certainly the most famous one. If you look at the various different manifestations of cryptids and so forth in any given state, you're going to have a lot of Sasquatch encounters. And Alabama, with all of its wilderness and forest and everything, it's a prime place for that, because you've got so much backcountry, so to speak. And it's kind of cool to start looking at these things. There's other accounts, Alabama, Wolfman. There's a story about a Wolfman in Alabama. There's a story about there's another local term. I can't remember what he's called right off. But, sometimes what we get are accounts that are Sasquatch, but they're given local names. And sometimes that's due to newspaper reporters. Sometimes it's just a slang term that the people in the region use, and they kind of throw it on there. We see this a lot in certain states. Indiana had a whole long period in the 1970s where all these monsters were popping up, and they all had individual names. But really, when you get down and examine the individual encounters, you see that they're essentially talking about Bigfoot. They're Sasquatch sightings, but, we'll call this one the Mill Race Monster, because it's seen around Mill Race Park, and then there's another one. So it's kind of interesting digging into these individual states and seeing how the culture and the traditions of the area apply certain things to the creatures. And this is the case with this white thing. They have this whole set of stories about it, attaching it to the idea of the thing showing up in cemeteries and at wakes, and it gives it sort of a quality of almost sort of otherworldly, saying that, well, this is attached somehow to the realm of ghosts and that part of the paranormal. But really, it's not. We're talking about, in the cases, for the most part, we're talking about flesh and blood creature.
Yeah, so do you think that they're actually, do you think the Bigfoots are out there in our forests, or do you think they're just kind of crossing over from a different dimension, so to speak?
Well, that's always a loaded question. That sets off a lot of traditional cryptozoologists, because when you get into traditional, Bigfoot study, so to speak, you've got two distinct groups. You've got people who believe that it's a flesh and blood creature, there's nothing supernatural about it. And then you sort of get the other extreme, who are saying, no, these are, highly evolved, they're psychic, they're all this and that. And quite honestly, having done this for so many years and seeing all the different beliefs and traditions from around the world, I kind of fall a little bit, I lean more towards the physical creature, but I have to give way to a certain degree to what people maybe would call supernatural aspects, because there are so many strange things about these sightings. And, what I frequently say is that it really sets people off if you throw around the word paranormal in conjunction with Bigfoot.
Yeah.
And what I like to point out is that, look, paranormal, it simply means something beyond the normal, something we don't understand yet. And my theory on these creatures is that they are physical beings, but that they have abilities or qualities about them that we just don't understand scientifically yet, or can't quite connect the pieces to yet, for instance. So as an example, I think it's highly likely that they are able to use infrasound. And, there's evidence for this, because we have other known animals that use infrasound, and it has a whole range of effects on humans. It affects the human nervous system. It can do all kinds of unusual things. So if they have a particular type of infrasound that they are able to utilize, that could explain some of the sightings where, we have someone watching a Sasquatch and suddenly something has happened and the beast is not there. The other thing I often say is that, it may be some type of very advanced biological camouflaging that they're able to utilize. And whether that is in conjunction with infrasound or whether it's something else, we obviously don't know yet. But, as a point of reference, I always say, imagine the first person who ever saw a chameleon. They're looking at a lizard that's over on a tree, and suddenly the thing's just gone. From their perspective, there was probably some type of strange, magic or something supernatural. But really, it's that creature's ability to blend into its surroundings. So while it would be unusual for a creature this large to have something like that, it certainly is possible, because we know that other biological creatures are able to do such things. So, I think that we need to, yes, understand that we're looking at something that most likely is physically real, because there's plenty of evidence. There's so many tracks and sightings and other things. But we also need to not completely discount the possibility or the potential that there are things about this creature that we simply don't understand yet scientifically, and that is what is affecting our perception of what these things can or can't do.
Do you think that they move around underground a lot, utilizing cave systems and such? Because here in Alabama, we have a huge cave network all over the state, all kinds of underground caves here.
I do. I think they're opportunistic. So, if they're in a region where there are plenty of caves, then absolutely, it's going to be like any other creature. A bear will utilize caves for shelter and to make a den. Other creatures will too. So, certainly if they're in an area where like you're talking about in Alabama, there's an abundance of caves, and absolutely they're gonna try to utilize those. I mean, I've seen reports from places like Kentucky where people have witnessed these things going in or out of caves, and we look at that whole region in the south, the southeast, and there's plenty of opportunity for them to do something like that. But then on the other hand, you see them in areas that are completely flat. I mean, there's plenty of sightings in Florida. I mean, they're roaming around the Everglades and different regions. So this is not an area where they're regulated or stuck to using caves for cover. But again, I think they take the opportunity to utilize whatever they can.
So what do you think the issue is with not being able to really get these things on film at all? I mean, everybody has cell phones now. I mean, if they were all over the place, like I guess your work kind of suggests, I mean, is it the fact that they just kind of have a feeling that we're near and just get away, I suppose?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. People are always saying, how come there aren't more pictures? One of the things I like to point out is if you spent much time in the field, it's not easy to catch a great photograph of wildlife, especially when it's something unexpected. So if you look at documentaries or writings from wildlife photographers, we're talking guys that work for National Geographic and things like that. Yeah, they catch some amazing photos of giraffes and lions and all these large creatures and so forth, or more elusive creatures. But when you really start digging in and finding out how they catch some of these photographs, some of these guys, they spend a tremendous amount of time in an area where this creature is known to be, camouflaged and just waiting and just, or, burning through footage or just being incredibly patient, hoping for that perfect shot. And these are creatures that we know about, we know where they live, we know, what their paths are, the watering holes and all these things. So, now when we're talking about Sasquatch, we're talking about a creature that intentionally remains elusive, whether through instinct or intelligence is hard to say, but they do intentionally avoid humans as much as possible, and at least all the evidence indicates that. So you combine that with the difficulty of catching photographs of something like that, then it starts to make a little bit more sense. I remember quite a few years ago, I was in Arizona. I was on a back road, and I was on a dirt road. I came around a bend in the road, and there crouched in the middle of the road was this incredible bobcat. So this creature was the lynx more properly. It was it was crouched down and it was watching something, so it didn't even see my Jeep as I came to a quick stop. And it was so focused on whatever was in the brush that it was just crouched waiting. Now, I always have a camera ready. And at that point, it wasn't even my cell phone camera. It was just a regular camera. And it was on the passenger seat. As soon as I saw this cat, I grabbed this camera and flipped it on. And in this, whatever fraction of a second or whatever it took the camera to turn on, this cat leapt off the road and was in the brush after whatever it was chasing. And, that was an incredible sighting, but guess what? I have no evidence of it. I had no picture. There's just this amazing sighting, but as quick as that was, I couldn't get that shot snapped off. And, people think, they hear these stories, I saw this and I tried to get a picture of it, but I couldn't. Well, there's kind of a logical reason for it. And I think if you're in a situation where you experience something like that, you start to realize, wow, it's not as easy as it sounds like. People can sit around their living rooms and, kind of complain and play the skeptic and say, well, should have caught a picture of it. But most of these sightings, these accounts, they're pretty brief, and people see this thing only for seconds very often.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I was in Colorado once, just driving with a friend, And we're on a dirt road out. I think it was Canyon Drive or something. And we come around a corner, and there was two bears right there on the road. And by the time we stopped, got our cell phones out and went to take a picture, they were gone. And we didn't get a very good picture of them at all. I think I got one,
Right.
but all you really see is just some black behind a bush.
Yeah, just a blur or something moving.
Yeah.
I would be more skeptical if somebody told me, that they had a sighting of Bigfoot and it lasted for, 30 minutes that they just sat and watched this thing. And well, if you had your phone with you, why didn't you pull it out and take a picture, if it's that long? But, truly most of these accounts, they just don't last very long. And the thing is that another thing a lot of people don't realize is that it's difficult for the average person to accurately judge time, especially when something unusual is happening to them. So the perception is sort of off, when they recall the event, and they'll say, well, I watched this thing. Well, how long did you watch it for? Oh, it was probably a couple of minutes. Probably it wasn't. It was probably less than a minute. It may have been 30 seconds or something. But, it's difficult to process when you're seeing something that you just don't expect to see, or something that is tremendously unusual, or in the case of something like Sasquatch, rather mythical. The average person is trying to process, what am I seeing? Am I really seeing this? Could it be something else? Oh my God. All these things are running through the consciousness. And, very frequently the first reaction is not to, oh, let me get my cell phone out and start recording footage. It's just not that frequent.
Yeah.
But, there's a lot of other evidence, too, with things like a lot of people believe that these things are sensitive to cameras and to infrared and things like that, because, of course, we have a lot of cases where people have, multiple sightings in an area, and, people will put out game cams and things like that, and the trail cams just come up with nothing, which is in itself kind of curious.
Yeah, and another thing you mentioned earlier, if they were utilizing caves, you would think that they would have another, they obviously, their eyes don't work the same way ours do. I mean, they're not down there holding torches while they walk around. I mean, they must be seeing their way through somehow, right?
Oh, sure. And, considering that there's so much evidence that they're, able to move around nocturnally fairly easily. So it's definitely something that, I think you have to consider in those sightings too. It's not normal human sight that we're talking about. So they are adapted in a different way. And that being the case, they very well may be able to perceive things like infrared and things like that on a different level.
Now, I would imagine that you get a lot of stories from a lot of people who have read some of your books, people constantly emailing you different encounters and such. How many different creatures do you think that there are? I mean, it has to be hundreds.
Gosh,
right?
I couldn't even hazard a guess, because, there's so many accounts just of the monsters that we sort of do chronicle on a regular basis. I mean, Sasquatch alone, there's Bigfoot accounts from really all over the world. Every region almost has a range of accounts, and sometimes there's hundreds or more, and sometimes it's just a handful. But then you move beyond that, and you're looking at water monsters are very commonly reported. Be it a lake, a river, or the ocean. And then you've got, of course, strange winged creatures that people report, everything from Mothman to Thunderbirds to other strange things that people see in the sky. And, those are kind of the big areas. Then you go beyond that. And, of course, one of the things that are really common around the United States in particular are anomalous cat sightings. So people, seeing these out-of-place felines that sometimes are described as being, it was an African lion, or it was a tiger, a Bengal tiger, and whatever. And then other people are reporting things that do kind of make sense, even though they might be out of place. For instance, in the East, we have a lot of reports of panthers. And, officially, panthers are extinct in the eastern half of the country, except for Florida. The Florida panther still officially exists. But beyond that, the standard wildlife official line is that no, there are no panthers, there are no cougars wandering around, North or South Carolina or Georgia or any of these places. But guess what? There are hundreds and hundreds of reports. I mean, just a crazy number of them. And of course, what's fascinating is that the ones that really drive the wildlife officials the most insane, I think, are the Black Panther accounts. Because, if you look at, again, what we know about known animals, they'll say, well, there's no such thing as a Black Panther. Now, what they mean is that the common pictures you see of like Black Panthers, now those are often black jaguars or cats that do have a pattern in their coat. It's just that their coat is completely black in this case. And that's not what people are claiming to see. What people are claiming to see is a creature that, for all intents and purposes, sounds just like a North American panther or cougar or mountain lion. Those are sort of interchangeable terms. But in normal circumstances, the known animals are that tawny color. However, people are reporting seeing those animals, yet they're solid black. And it just confounds officials because they swear that there can be no such thing. But what's interesting is that there are so many of these reports. You can't, it's hard to just dismiss it and say, well, no, there's no such thing, because you get people from, different parts of the country who've never heard of each other, who've never heard about each other's accounts. And, they know what they saw. And I talked to people in North Carolina, veteran hunters who've been outdoorsmen their whole lives and knew every creature in the Carolina backwoods. But, they have an incident where one night, or one day sometimes, this creature strolls across in front of them, and it very clearly to them is a panther, and it's solid black. So, these are reports that are, I think, are very fascinating, because it's not so much a stretch in some people's minds. We're not talking about, Mothman, for instance, this giant winged humanoid creature that's zipping around in the air. Now we're talking about something that, by all accounts, it sounds like a creature that we certainly should be aware of, but it doesn't officially exist, and there's no defined evidence to say, yes, this creature is here.
Now, have you had any reports or stories coming in that any of these cryptids are seen to be using any type of technology?
Technology? No, I haven't really heard that. I mean, some of the more extreme cases you get, or that I get, you hear things that sound more like people are describing an alien type of encounter. But those, sound very different just from the get-go usually. If we're talking about strict cryptid reports, then you're basically talking about unusual animals or strange creatures that people are spotting. And, while the bulk of these fall into certain groupings, as I was just describing, you do get some unusual ones here and there that are just so strange, you just don't know how to classify them.
Yeah.
And, I've talked to some of my colleagues at times about this. We sort of, sometimes we'll share these reports and say, I just don't even know what to do with this one. It's just so weird that, where exactly does it fit? And, in some of those cases, at least, I think that what we get is a situation where people are seeing an unusual creature, but for some reason the encounter is, whether it's poor lighting or whether there's something going on that distorts the experience for the person. It's hard to say. I'll give you an example. We get these accounts of the lizard man in Scapel Swamp. And my good friend Lyle Blackburn, he looks into that pretty closely. And, it seems to be that in that case, we're probably talking about Sasquatch that is living in the swamp. You can call it a skunk ape or a swamp ape or whatever you want to. But the thing is that a creature living in those conditions is going to look different. Just because of the environment that it's living in. It's probably going to be wet most of the time. It's probably going to stink a lot more than some of the other places that the thing might live. So that in itself distorts the appearance of this thing. And I think some people just don't know how to describe that. But again, the perception really gets screwed with in these cases because you've got people, the average witness is someone who hasn't really seen anything anywhere near like this before in their lives. They don't know exactly how to classify it or where to put it. How does this fit into their worldview, so to speak? So, how do they reconcile this with their knowledge base? Unless they're familiar, of course, with Bigfoot accounts, which more and more people are all the time because of the popular media. But, traditionally, people just have a hard time knowing, wow, what is this thing? How do I even, relate what I saw or what I experienced?
Now, does Bigfoot seem to be more of an isolated creature, or do you think they, I guess, roam around in packs?
Most of the sightings, for the most part, they're of individuals. There's certainly plenty of evidence that they communicate with each other and that they have some kind of shared communication, if you will. There's a lot of evidence that the common wood knocking, for instance, that a lot of people experience, are a way for these things to communicate. The same is true with, a lot of people believe that they have some type of language that they're able to speak with each other with this very guttural. Sometimes it's termed samurai chatter because it sounds, to some people's ears, similar to archaic Japanese. And there's different theories about that, but really when it comes down to it, again, we just don't know enough of the facts about these creatures to be able to determine exactly what's going on here. Certainly, some of the classic cases, we hear evidence of them living at the least in family units. There's a famous Albert Ostman abduction that involves what appear to be a family of Sasquatch, and that's a very curious case. But many of the sightings, of course, are of individual creatures.
Could you tell us about that case? I haven't heard that one before.
Oh, you don't know this case? Yeah. So this is a really strange encounter. This came from a gentleman named Albert Ostman, who was a prospector in British Columbia. And he recorded an incident that occurred when he was prospecting in the 1920s. He was kind of, he was a classic outdoorsman, so to speak. He was up on his own, trekking up into British Columbia and searching out different areas. And he says that he was sleeping in his sleeping bag, and that something picked him up and carried him away. Now, he was sort of thrown over this thing's shoulders, so to speak, and the creature walked for, I want to say it was like 3 hours, 2 or 3 hours from where Ostman's camp was. And it took him to this area, it kind of flopped him down, and he described a scenario where he was kept captive for several days by these creatures. He he realized when he came, of course, out of his sleeping bag and looked around that, these creatures, there were several of them. It appeared to be a family of 4 that were, he doesn't know exactly. There's speculation as to why they abducted him. It's kind of strange, but they were not going to let him go. They kept watch over him, and as he sort of tries to figure out what to do, he's watching these creatures. One of them he described, the male has somewhere around 8 feet tall. And Ostman, he looks at the items that he had with him, because he had one of his packs with him that was attached to the sleeping bag or something. So he had a few items. And eventually what happens is that he sort of develops his own escape, because he takes out a container of snuff. And he opens this thing up, and the male, the largest Sasquatch, gets curious about it and takes this container from him and downs the whole thing. And you can imagine the reaction of this thing pouring a whole can of this stuff into its mouth. And Ostman took the opportunity to escape from the site and ran away. It turned out, as I said, he was several hours away from his original campsite. He ends up making it back, and he didn't tell his story for a long time. He only told it much later. It's like 20-some years later or something, he recounts this whole tale. And, it's an intriguing encounter for a number of reasons. One is that he was in country where there's so many sightings in British Columbia, and there's so much incredible land up there, so much just unexplored territory. I've been in British Columbia a few times, and it's a beautiful, rugged country. And, it's certainly a prime place for these kind of creatures to live, that's for sure. Ostman, one of the things that impresses me about his encounter is that when you look back on this, he really had no reason to tell this story. There's nothing that, benefited him by sharing it. In fact, it was probably, more detrimental than anything, for him telling it. He was in, I think, his 60s by the time he shared the account. And, it's, bear in mind, this was the 1950s by the time he told the story. So, there's no internet, there's no, YouTube or anything like that for instant fame. And, he wasn't looking for attention in that sense. So from those points, we kind of had to consider it and say, well, we're talking about an old school guy that had no reason really to tell, this story and to share this account. Other people are more skeptical of it, just because obviously we don't have any evidence. It's far beyond the time or the point at which we could investigate it very well. And I can kind of see both sides of it, because it's one of those really crazy tales that we have to say, wow, why, did this really happen? Does this guy make this up for some reason? But again, I think it's a pretty intriguing tale, and it certainly is one of the classics in the field of Bigfoot, because it's so unusual, and it kind of falls right into that range of classic encounters with a little bit more, so to speak, because he gave a detailed description of these creatures, their appearance, and what was happening. Different things, when he was there in their camp. I mean, they would give him like the bits of food and things like that. So it's a curious story.
What were they eating? Did he say what they were eating?
Yeah, he talked about them eating some kind of in fact, they gave him at some point what he described as a sweet-tasting grass. So, obviously some kind of an herb or a plant or something that they had gotten from the area, I guess, and eaten. And they gave it to him too. So, it's, again, it's really curious because the other aspect of this, we're talking about the 1950s, and this really is before accounts of these creatures were very widespread. Of course, we had the Patterson-Gimlin film years later. So, by the time Ostman told this account, what was around mostly were Native American lore and different tales and sightings and so forth regionally from British Columbia and parts of Canada. But again, it simply wasn't as widespread as it became in later years.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting story. Now, I've done a show before on moon-eyed people, I suppose, of the Southeast. Have you heard anything about moon-eyed people?
Yeah, it's a North Carolina legend, and it seems to be indicating another earlier race that lived in the region prior to extensive settlement. The Cherokees talk about them, and there are some very strange artifacts that have been found in North Carolina that relate to these people, these beings, whatever they are. It's kind of fascinating because we get a lot of different tales of little people and other races who traditional lore from Native American tribes say lived here long before they did even. And this is one of those cases with the moon-eyed people. Unfortunately, the accounts are pretty scant. We'll just have a few stories from Cherokee tales and then occasional accounts, but those kind of cross over into territory that sounds like we're talking about accounts of little people in general. And that's something that's particularly fascinating for me because I've collected accounts from all over the world, really, but there are a lot of accounts right in the United States of people seeing what they variously describe as gnomes or trolls or leprechauns, or a whole range of different terms that they use. But again, if we go back to Native tradition, then a lot of Native tribes from around the country have stories of races of little people that lived here well before the tribe itself did.
Yeah, the Cherokee actually had a war with them, I was hearing.
Yeah, that's sort of a tale that carries over. You find that in a lot of different places. There are stories of the Native people in the region having a war or a conflict of some kind with this other tribe of beings, and inevitably, obviously, the other tribe lost. So the natives hold the land, and the others go away, so to speak. Now, that becomes very interesting to me because when you hear these stories, there are a lot of them from Europe and North America and other regions that talk about this conflict, and then they say that the others left through, sometimes it's a hole in the earth, sometimes it's a shimmering doorway. There's different things, and essentially I think what we're talking about are portals. These things have traveled or left somehow to essentially another level of existence. And I know for some people that starts to sound a little bit out there, a little bit too supernatural for some taste. But really, if you start looking at those concepts and those traditional stories and compare it to where science, particularly quantum science, is now, quantum scientists are now telling us, hey, we know there are other levels of existence. I think their last count is a dozen or something. We know there are 12 other levels of existence. We don't know what's there or how to get there, but we know it's there. And of course, my response is always, okay, well, just because we can't get there doesn't mean something there can't get here. I think that when you look at a lot of these old ancient stories from cultures who have held these oral traditions and passed these stories down for so many years, I think you're looking at instances of things coming and sometimes and often going through these portals.
Now, see, that brings in a whole nother aspect of thinking about things like this, and I wanted to get your take on it. Is it possible that our minds just and our eyes just aren't capable of seeing these things, like they're there all the time? Our consciousness is just not at a point where our mind or our eyes are able to see them?
I think that's a distinct possibility, and certainly when you get into certain topics, you find that sort of reflected in the lore around the entity. What I mean by that is, as an example, the jinn. So the jinn, which really go back to the early days of Islam and the whole tale of the creation of the world, so to speak. You've got these creatures that were, in this case, created by Allah. Allah created humans, angels, and jinn. And when the jinn would not submit to the superiority of humans, then they were banished. Now, what exactly does that mean? When you read the ancient text, they will say that they're banished, they're not eradicated. They're just banished, yet they still exist. So there are all these stories of the jinn being among us. They're in the desert, they're in abandoned buildings, they're in all these places. And, traditional mystics from that region that I've spoken with, they'll say, well, they exist side by side with us, essentially, but we're just not able to perceive them. They'll say sort of the exact thing that you're talking about. They'll say, well, they're here, but we just can't see them or perceive them in the same way unless they want us to know they're there.
Yeah.
And it's almost as if you're talking about something that is perhaps vibrating on a different level, if I could use that term, or just existing with us. It is a very strange concept to start to wrap your head around, but it does have potential in perhaps approaching an understanding of some of these bizarre topics that we talk about and understanding how these things are there. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not in our perceptions. And, certainly how there are cases where someone suddenly experiences something, be it a creature or, a sasquatch or a jinn or whatever it is, and then it's just suddenly gone. Well, perhaps that's not because it went somewhere, because perhaps it's because our consciousness opened briefly or long enough for us to perceive it in a different way. And I think that those are mysteries that, they're so deep and there's so many directions we could go with them, truly, because really we've only scratched the surface of understanding human consciousness, the human energy field, and what we're truly capable of, at our greatest potential. So who knows what we could actually perceive.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think that I think the possibilities are endless when it comes to the power of our own brains.
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, you go back to ancient traditions. It's always kind of curious to me, because I see the quantum sciences sort of reaching backwards in a sense and addressing things that old traditions have been talking about for a very, very long time. The idea of the human energy field is a great example, because, of course, for the longest time, science denied there was any such thing. It said, no, that's not real. But then we had things like in the 70s when people really started studying, for instance, the potential of the aura, and, started looking at plants having an energy field and being more conscious than we realize, and really it sort of branched off from there. So we've gotten to the point where, now in modern times, people are doing more to document things like healing touch, or the transmission of qi through things like qigong and healing, and they're seeing that, wow, there is something that transpires here that we can start to document and start to see. But again, that's only the tip of the iceberg. What is the true potential of being able to fully utilize that energy and work with it and consciously direct it.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about your book, Monsters at the Crossroads, Cryptids and Legends of Indiana. So I have to tell you, the illustrations on your book covers are fantastic. I'm sure that you get that a lot.
I do. That's artist Sam Sharon. I always give him props for that. And he has done all the Cryptid State series, and he's done the Wood Knot series also. He's done a couple of the other books too, but he's an incredible artist, and Sam is great because I'll come up with a cover concept and the creatures, and tell him sort of loosely, hey, this is what I want to see, and he always comes back with just a stunning illustration. And the Cryptid State series, he's been doing a full wrap cover so that the back also displays usually a couple things hidden in there. There's always a sasquatch on the back somewhere, and we usually tuck another cryptid back there too. With the Cryptid State series, I'm trying to, for the cover, present often a cryptid that is very clearly associated with the state, and just is not as common overall. So, for instance, we had a Thunderbird on the cover of the Arizona book because of the Tombstone Thunderbird legend and so forth. And the Indiana book, which came out late last year, is the cover is the Beast of Busco. It's Oscar. It's a giant turtle.
Yeah. Now, I did want to ask you a little bit about Oscar the giant turtle. What's the story between that? Is it just a large snapping turtle, I suppose?
Well, on the surface, you could say, "Oh, yeah, it's just a giant snapping turtle," but there's a lot more to it. It's a very intriguing tale. It's sort of a human story in some ways, and it actually starts in 1898 when a gentleman named Oscar Falk, who owned a farm in Indiana, saw this giant turtle living in this lake on his property. And Falk just left the creature alone. And the only reason the story got around was that he went into town and, he told people, "Oh, there's this giant turtle, that's in my lake." And it was left alone. Nobody did anything about it. But, what happens is the story kind of fast forwards to 1947, excuse me, when a gentleman named Gale Harris purchased the property. And Harris, too, was a farmer. He purchased the land so that he could make a living as a farmer. He and his family are living there, and they start doing normal farm-related things. He's out the summer after he purchased the property. He's out on his barn up on the roof with another gentleman, and they're doing some repairs. And they spot something in the water. So and sort of backing up from that, he had heard a story. Harris himself had heard a story from his brother-in-law, who claimed that he had seen a giant turtle in that lake. And Harris sort of dismissed it because he was like, well, his brother-in-law is kind of a prankster, and you can't take everything he says seriously. But then Harris himself saw it. And he and another gentleman who were working on the barn, they spot this thing. They watch it for a little bit, and it kind of swims around in the water above the surface and then goes away. And then they have another sighting. Well, Harris, he just randomly decides he's going to check this creature out, and he goes out to see if he can spot it on the water. And he sees it. He sees this giant turtle, and he says that the head of the thing is bigger than a baby, and he's talking about how massive this thing is. And he calls it initially Mr. Turtle. And in fact, that's what he mostly called it the whole time. He ends up deciding that he's going to catch this thing because it's such a massive specimen. And the story gets pretty crazy from that point on, because what happens, and I'll give you the short version, what happens is that Harris starts spending all of his time and energy trying to catch this turtle. He comes up with one scheme after another. He tries fishing lines, he tries nets, he ends up offering, for people to come from out of the area to try to catch it if they think they can catch it. The media got hold of the story, and it ends up being posted on the wire service, so it becomes a sort of nationwide thing. Suddenly this hunt for this giant turtle, and all these people, they're sort of hanging on every daily report what's going to happen. Is the turtle going to be caught? Now, the name gets thrown on it by the locals because of the original sighting by Oscar Fulks. So sort of in honor of that sighting, they dubbed the turtle Oscar. And the town itself, which is Churubusco, is added to the name in a sense because, they call it Busco for short. So he becomes the Beast of Busco, or Oscar, the Beast of Busco. And everyone is sort of watching this story as it unfolds and all the crazy things that Harris comes up with to try to catch the turtle. This famous turtle hunters purportedly come from out of state, try to capture it. Harris at one point decides to pump the lake dry, and he rigs up this whole contraption that's run with his tractor engine and all this tubing and these pipes, and he's pumping water out of this lake around the clock, which is costing a fortune, and bear in mind that what's happening at the same time is that he's not spending any time planting crops. He's not farming, which is how he makes his living. He's not doing anything but focusing all of his time and energy and money on trying to catch this turtle. The story really kind of, it's sad in a lot of ways because it's very much about this man's obsession with trying to capture Oscar. And he eventually, he just drives himself into bankruptcy. The farm ends up getting foreclosed on, and, it gets sold off at auction. The media, they were very fascinated by it for a while, but as the media does, it's fickle. And once the story had kind of run its course, they, for the most part, stopped reporting on it. There were daily reports for a while, and there was so much massive attention that at one point they said they had police officers, law enforcement was out to regulate traffic on the road leading to Harris's farm because there were so many vehicles from people going to the farm hoping to catch a glimpse of Oscar. They parked everywhere. They parked all over this man's fields. They were just, completely disrespectful, and all they wanted was to catch a glimpse of the giant turtle. They didn't care that they were parking on farmland or blocking him in. They blocked his kid, and his kid couldn't even get out to get to school. It's all these things that are happening that are human elements of this man's obsession with trying to capture this turtle. And eventually, he never catches the turtle. He ends up losing the farm, as I said. He moves his family into town and ends up taking a job for an electric company. And turtle is just left to its own, left alone, so to speak. The people that purchased the farm made a public statement and said that they had no interest in bothering Oscar, and that if he was still there, he could live out the rest of his life in peace. But the legend is really cool because it did a lot of things. It inspired a whole sort of tale that bound this community together in some way. It wasn't long after the incident that the community started Turtle Days, a celebration. Really, I think that's probably the oldest one focused around a cryptid. And, it's still going to, of course, it didn't run last year, but it's still going in this day and age. And, Turtle Days are every year. They celebrate the Beast of Busco, and it's sort of a family-friendly big festival that is held to raise money for the community and so forth. And it remains a very curious legend.
That's a great story. It doesn't sound like they ever When was the farm sold?
Oh, the farm was sold in, I think it was, maybe 49 or something, because I don't have the date right off the top of my head. It took him, Harris bought the farm in 47, and, he only held it a brief time, essentially, before he was bankrupt.
So Oscar
else.
could still be out there, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's possible. There's all kinds of stories that grew up around it, in the aftermath, because there were stories about a Native American man a chief who had been in the region prior, who purportedly had a giant turtle as a pet. Then there were accounts afterwards of people seeing a giant turtle in other areas right around there. A lot of people thought that Oscar left that lake at some point and just went to another body of water somewhere because he was tired of being harassed. I mean, Harris did crazy stuff. At one point, he ran cables and he shocked the lake, hoping that he could use electricity to scare Oscar out of the water. And of course, that didn't work either. And he decided, well, it didn't work because Oscar just dug into the mud and the silt at the bottom of the lake, and was unfazed by it. So we've got a case where this guy held the property for 2-3 years, and by 1950 the farm is auctioned off and he's gone away, and the turtle carries on. So the cryptid wins, I guess you could say.
That's a fascinating story. I recommend anybody that's listening to go ahead and grab your book and get it on Amazon. It's called Monsters at the Crossroads, Cryptids and Legends of Indiana. I guess there's a bunch of stories in there. A Confederate soldier turning into a werewolf, oil pit squids, all kinds of crazy cryptids, and of course phantom cats and out-of-place gorillas. It seems like a fascinating book, and the cover is absolutely just amazing to look at. I want to talk to you a second about black-eyed kids, because I guess we got about 15 minutes left, and I do want to squeeze a little black-eyed kids story into this show. What can you tell us about them? Now we've done a show on black-eyed kids before about how they tend to want to ride somewhere. We talked to a guy who said he saw some black-eyed kids asking him for a ride, and then 20, 30 years later, the same exact kids showed up at his house wanting to get in his house. Are these primarily the types of stories you hear?
For the most part, sure. That's a bit unusual. It's unusual for people to have multiple encounters with these things, although on rare occasions it does happen. I haven't heard that particular account you're talking about, but these accounts are sort of all within the same parameters with a few variations here and there. And inevitably what these entities are after are entrance, whether it's an entry into your vehicle or your home or your place of business or whatever it is. That's definitely one of the common themes of encounters with these things.
Yeah, it seems to be interesting stories. You wrote a couple books on them. What's the creepiest black-eyed kid story you've heard? One
of the creepiest, I don't know if it's the creepiest, but I'll tell you one of the creepiest is one that came from Texas, and it was from a gentleman who he got home. He had been to the market, and he got out of his truck. He had a few bags of groceries, and he walked across to his door. Now, his front door had a small set of steps that led up to it, and there's really nothing in this gentleman's yard. It's not full of trees or bushes or anything like that. It's just not much there. It's pretty bare. And as he climbs the few steps to his vehicle, to his front door, after getting out of his vehicle, he suddenly sees that there is a young man standing on the ground next to his steps. And of course, this is somewhat shocking because this guy wasn't there, just moments before, and he sort of looks over at this boy who stares at him. He has solid black eyes, very pale skin. He looks at the gentleman, and his comment is it food time? This gentleman, he just doesn't know what to do with this. He doesn't even respond initially because he's trying to, I was speaking about earlier, he's trying to process this. No one speaks like that, obviously. And the boy repeats this. He says, I think it's food time. You should invite me in. Now, this gentleman has, in the course of this, had opened his front door, which is standing open, and he doesn't want to take his eyes off of this kid, but he sort of sees out of his peripheral vision that his dog is charging down the hallway. Now, the layout is that when the front door opens, there's a long hallway that goes back to the living room. And he sees out of his peripheral vision his trained attack dog coming around the corner, charging down the hallway towards the front door. The dog is barking, he's snarling, he's in attack mode. He almost reaches the front door when he tries to put the brakes on. Now, this is kind of a Scooby-Doo moment because he said this dog sort of dug in its hindquarters, but it was moving so fast that it fell over itself. So it tumbled over itself down the steps onto the yard, onto the ground, and just as quickly it jumped back up, now with its tail between its legs, running back up the steps and back in the house, terrified. Now, this was enough for this gentleman who quickly jumped in the door and slammed the door. The gentleman ran around to another room so that he could peer out the window and see what this kid was doing. And when he did so, the kid was gone. The dog was very affected by this encounter. It hid under the bed. For days he had issues with this dog even getting it to act normal because it was so traumatized, so affected by the presence of whatever this thing was. And, I think that I think it's a very creepy account. As I said, again, no one speaks that way. That's not normal language. Is it food time? And when you combine that with this reaction from this animal, we know that animals perceive things differently than we do. They sense things differently. Yeah. And something just terrified this animal. Something about this kid terrified this animal to the point that it altered the dog's behavior. Now, this gentleman told me that this dog prior to that was very well trained. It was, he had seen it kill snakes. It was, essentially fearless. And suddenly just being in the presence of this thing, whatever it was, I don't believe for a minute it was actually a kid, but being in this thing's presence altered this dog's behavior. I think that's one of the most significant sightings that I've come across, just because of the various aspects we can examine from the encounter. The classical black-eyed kid aspect with the appearance, the strange request, and so forth. But then also, again, this animal's reaction and how it perceived what was going on. And, of course, the witness's reaction, too, because, has this typical, he felt very disturbed and just didn't know, he was sort of locked up. He couldn't figure out how to respond, because how do you, if you suddenly see someone that issues a comment like that, how do you respond? It's the last thing you're expecting. This kid has come out of nowhere. There's nowhere for him to have popped up out of or to have, suddenly disappeared too. So, again, it's like we were talking about earlier. How do you balance these perceptions, or how do you understand what you're experiencing with this situation, and how do you reconcile it with what you do understand?
Now, what do you think they are? You think it's a demonic entity, or do you think that they're cryptids all in their own right?
I wouldn't call them a cryptid because they're not animals, so to speak. But I do believe that I personally, I think there's something interdimensional. This kind of goes back to the theme we were talking about earlier with this idea that something can live on another level of existence, sort of right along beside us, but not exactly, sort of just a step over, if you will. And it's sort of the encounters sort of follow this theme where they kind of come and go as they please, and they don't seem to follow the normal rules, if you will. They don't appear as you and I would, walk into a doorway or something like that. There's something different about how they're manifesting. And if we look at them in comparison with a lot of other traditional lore, for instance, the jinn and so forth, then we can draw a lot of comparisons. One of the things I think that's confounding about the black-eyed children is that they share things in common with a lot of other types of strange phenomena. You mentioned demons. That's one of the most popular theories. In fact, the two most popular theories are sort of at opposite ends of the spectrums in a way. On the one hand, a lot of people believe there's something demonic, something literally from the depths of hell. And then other people believe that these things are some kind of an alien-human hybrid that are, attempting to do whatever, invade or exert some kind of control or whatnot. And while those things sound very, very different, at the same time, there are a lot of similarities we could look at in those manifestations. And if we really start to examine these different accounts from people really all around the world, as I said, we can look at a lot of different potentials for what they could be. So that leaves me with having to look at something that sort of can cover all the bases and do a lot of different things. And as I stated, I go back to the idea that there's something interdimensional.
Yeah, they seem to be. It's one of the, I guess, the biggest stories that scare me half to death. And another one would be shadow people. I kind of think that they're kind of from the same realm, so to speak, wherever that is.
Yeah, it could be. And it's fascinating when you look at some of this phenomena. There's a lot of people, of course, that think they have all the answers, but the reality is we really don't have the answers about a lot of these things. And shadow people is something else that you can look at. It's a little bit more focused, a little bit narrower, but again, there could be several things that explain what those entities are. I covered that some in my Strange Intruders book, and it's a very popular topic because so many people have seen some form of shadow person. When you get down to the bare bones of the encounters, then I think that you have to consider that there's not going to be necessarily one explanation that covers all the bases for what these things are. In some cases, I believe that they're possibly a residual energy from different traumatic, haunted locations. But in other cases, I think there's something clearly very conscious that, moves and interacts to a degree. And of course, many people report them being very menacing and sinister in nature.
Well, David, it seems like you've got a lot of writing to do. How many states do you've got knocked out so far?
Well, let's see. This is, I think the fifth one is about to come out, which is North Carolina. I'll be announcing another one soon after that, and there'll be a few of those out this year probably. But everybody's anxious, and, you can always hit me up if you have accounts from your own state. I welcome people sharing their encounters. You can reach me through my website, which is eerielights.com. There's a contact form on there. I always love to hear people's stories.
Awesome. And that's eerielights.com. The link will be in the description below. David Weatherly, thank you very much for taking time to speak with us today. We certainly do appreciate you we appreciate you coming on the show.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me on.
All right. And we'll be right back on Conflict Radio right after this. Welcome back to Conflict Radio. That was David Weatherly. Be sure to check out his website, eerielights.com. You can always look in the description box below for the link, and you can click on it there. Check out all of his books. and I'm sure he gets a lot of stories from a lot of people, so we're going to look forward to having him on again in the future. Remember, you can always find us on conflictradio.net. Just go to www.conflictradio.net. We're available on Apple iTunes, Spreaker, and all of your normal podcast catchers. Jared Murphy and I are going to start doing open lines live shows the last Thursday of every month at 8 p.m. Central Time. That's 9 p.m. Eastern. And this month, January 28th at 9 p.m. Eastern, is going to be our open line show. We encourage you to give a call in, Truck Bam, and check out the show. We usually go through and we'll talk in the chat to people in the chat room with us. So be sure to check that out on our Conflict Radio official YouTube channel. Until next time, batten down the hatches and be safe.